The talking heads of college football, present company included, spend an incredible amount of time prognosticating the various if-then scenarios for future matchup outcomes and their impact on the playoff during the season. I think these dark days of college football withdrawal offer an equally interesting opportunity to indulge in playoff fantasy porn, a retrospective playoff selection show. Here are a few alternate scenarios that I'd like to offer up for discussion. So we're going to start with each of these scenarios, and we're going to see what our final four would be and how things might have changed. Scenario number 1. What if Ohio State does not lose to Oregon? All of the other results, including Michigan's win against Ohio State in the final game of the regular season to clinch the Big Ten East, Michigan's win in the Big Ten championship game, and all the rest of Ohio State's results are exactly the same. Who makes the college football playoff in 2021 if Ohio State does not lose? CJ Stroud had them coming back. Remember? Like there was a little bit of life and a little bit of effort. And what's the it's like I tell you what, if there were 5 quarters in that game, I feel like it's Mac Brown might have said it, it's like I told our guys if there were 5 quarters in that game, we would have won it. Like there's something coachy in there. But if there were 5 quarters in Ohio State, Oregon, I don't know. Ohio State might have won that game. So if Ohio State beats Oregon, all the other scenarios are the same. Who makes the final college football playoff? A reminder that Ohio State on selection day finished at number 6 in the final college football playoff rankings. In the very first release, they were number 5. That was, of course, after the loss. 4, all the way up to number 2 prior to the Michigan game. So with the Oregon loss, they were still at number 2 prior to that second loss to Michigan. So who makes the final 4 in that scenario where Ohio State beats Oregon?
So just for these scenarios, I do want to point out, we are assuming everything else is exactly the same.
Correct.
Right. So all other results are the same.
And I think this shows the fragility of some of college football. The fact that we can flip one result and have some major impact on the final playoff.
Tom Fornelli would have been the genius. His conspiracy theory of Cincinnati's not getting in, never getting in, no group of 5 would have been realized. We would have had Ohio State, Michigan, Alabama, Georgia.
Yeah, I think Danny really nailed it there. We were very close to having a bit of a disaster scenario in college football in 2021. There are actually several that hinged just on one result, and the committee was quite fortunate that Tom did not end up being correct, and Danny did not. We didn't end up having to test Danny's 2-loss Alabama theory, which hey, maybe that's coming up. But Ohio State in that game had a 56% post-game win probability. So it is not outlandish to think they could have won. I mean, Chip's point is well taken, and they could have really won this thing in regulation had they been a little bit better with their execution inside of Oregon's 30-yard line. Definitely in this scenario, obviously Bama, Michigan, and Georgia, and then Ohio State or Cincinnati. They were only separated by 2 spots, as Chip noted. So the Oregon win for Ohio State then would become a win over a 9-4 Oregon team, an Oregon team that would not have had that high early season rating to carry it throughout. It kind of had some helium throughout the year because it did have that head-to-head over Ohio State. However, I think because they won the Pac-12 North, even though it was not a great division this year, certainly with Washington and Stanford and those guys and the Washington State chaos, I think that a 9-4 Oregon team is probably still ranked, right?
Yes.
I would guess that one of the losses would be the championship game.
Yeah, and the loss, they were up to number 3 in the college football playoff rankings prior to the regular season loss to Utah. The regular season loss to Utah knocked them down to number 11. And then after the conference championship game loss to Utah, they finished selection day at number 14.
So, right. So here's how I think this would go. Hey, this game was all snowy. It was a close game for most of it. Michigan blew it open late. Ohio State was undefeated until this point, and I do think Cincinnati gets bounced in this scenario. And to have 2 rematches from the regular season as the Final Four, you want to talk about devaluing the regular season, right? Hey, don't expand to 12. 4 keeps the prestige of the regular season alive. guys, we were.
I had it seeded differently. I had it seeded Alabama 1, Michigan 2, Georgia 3, Ohio State 4, setting up an Alabama, Ohio State, and a Michigan, Georgia, which, I mean, you want to talk about the conspiracy theory. Not only is Cincinnati out, but you've got ratings bonanza with Alabama, Ohio State, and Michigan, Georgia. Of course, a game that we did get the opportunity to see. I figured that Michigan with the Big Ten championship would get the nod ahead of Georgia, who would just fall to number 3, Ohio State, which did not play for a championship, but whose only loss was to number 2 team. I thought that they would get in at number 4, Cincinnati at 5, and then Notre Dame at 6, with its only loss, of course, coming to Cincinnati. That one would have been incredible. So notes from Corey on that one. Is this the doomsday scenario of 2 SEC, 2 Big Ten teams? I believe that this would be very bad for college football, but also unavoidable in this scenario. So,
yeah, would it be? I don't know if that would have been bad for college football. Like to have Cincinnati get left out over, I don't know. I get it. Like I would have, trust me, I would have been pounding the table too. Like how can they get screwed over? But is that a bad Final Four?
No, it's great. I mean, it's extremely entertaining. But when there was too much conversation around Cincinnati all season, started in August, and we carried it through the year, and for it to end like that, I mean, that would have made Mike Oresco's notes in his letter to college football
way more poignant.
Yes, 100%. Which speaks to your point, Danny, about the timing. Yeah. Okay. Scenario number 2. Michigan loses a, parentheses, very losable game versus Nebraska. So all the other results are the same, including Michigan beating Ohio State. So in that scenario, if Michigan goes to beat Ohio State, but Ohio State has one loss, Ohio State still wins the Big Ten East. Because Michigan's lost to Michigan State.
Right.
And Michigan loses to Nebraska. Ohio State has gotten into the Big Ten championship game. How does that change the Final Four?
Let me ask you a question there. Are we assuming that Ohio State wins out because of power ratings? Like Ohio State wins the Big Ten here? This is the only one where we do need to make an assumption of what happens next.
Ohio State has lost to Oregon in this scenario. This is not the last one. So they've got the non-conference loss to Oregon, and they've got the loss to Michigan. But because that was their only conference loss,
they go to the Big Ten title game. So are we giving them that win, I assume?
Yeah, I think so. If
that's what I did too in my analysis.
Yes, I gave them the win, but we were talking about a 2-loss conference champion, and we have not yet seen a 2-loss conference champion in the college football playoff. The debate would be, the way that I broke this down, the debate would be the 2-loss conference champion going up against Notre Dame, more than likely.
Which is also not a conference champion.
Yes, but would only have one loss to a Cincinnati team who in this scenario would be in the college football playoff, I believe.
Denny, you want to take this one first?
I think the 2-loss conference champ, Big Ten champ, would have been in.
Even with the late loss to Michigan.
Yeah, because Michigan was still a top 10-ish team, top 7. What were they?
They were 7 on November 2nd in the first release, and they were not even in the top 4 until November 30th. And I had figured that would be a little bit lower because they would also have this hypothetical Nebraska loss. The Nebraska game was in Lincoln on October 9th. It was a 32-29 Michigan win. That is the game that we're flipping. So Michigan would have a lower ranking going into the game against Ohio State, but we still give them that win against Ohio State. They do not go to the Big Ten championship game. Ohio State does because it doesn't have any other conference losses beyond that one, and Michigan has 2. Ohio State, we're saying, beats Iowa. Does the 2-loss Ohio State team become the first 2-loss college football playoff team?
Same score in that game too?
Yeah, same score.
Yeah.
That brings it up a little more in doubt. Then I think maybe Notre Dame gets the edge. I forgot about the score and the domination that was there. Even though it was in Ann Arbor, if it was close and it was in Ann Arbor, maybe, but they got beat pretty bad. So I think that would hurt them. So I would say Notre Dame would get in that scenario.
So I think actually I'm going to go with Ohio State here because the conference championship. Now Notre Dame really did turn it on at times down the stretch, but if you look at the Irish's schedule, I think that the committee would have had a field day, or maybe they wouldn't, right? But if I'm looking at this, I would say, hey, they played a lot of names, but not a lot of actual good teams. I mean, think about this, like the names on Notre Dame's schedule, as I vamp and pull it up here from last year, who the Irish beat. So Florida State, not a good team, right? Purdue, okay. Wisconsin, I think actually a pretty good team. To me, that was their best win. They lost to Cincinnati at home by 11. Virginia Tech, bad. USC, pretty bad. I mean, 82nd in SP plus. North Carolina, 59th. Navy, 102nd, like one of the worst Navy teams we've seen. I mean, other than that COVID team. UVA, again, like not a very good team. And they didn't have Brennan Armstrong in that game, if I recall, right? That was the one we all loaded up on Notre Dame, hypothetically. And Georgia Tech, again, I mean, spiraling losses mounting all the time. Stanford, just a horrendous year. Stanford 105th, Georgia Tech 96th. So their strength of schedule with a top 10 Oklahoma State team in there was 40th. If you pull Oklahoma State out, because obviously they're not going to play Oklahoma State in the regular season before the bowl games, you're looking at a strength of schedule that is probably like in the 60s or 70s. And if you adjust for Armstrong being out, you rate UVA as like maybe a top 100 team and not like a top 60-ish team. I think Notre Dame's schedule would have got probably skewered here a little bit. And look, I mean, Danny, you proposed it yourself. We were somewhat close to having a 2-loss Bama team in the national title game.
That's our next scenario. So, and the Notre Dame is a key piece of this. So.
But a 2-loss conference championship team from the second best conference in football, I don't think is that crazy. And Notre Dame knows the deal. They basically have to go undefeated because they don't play a conference title game, and they did not do so.
Another significant detail of this, I think, is if we're going to give them the Buckeyes a win against Iowa, is the final positioning of Iowa, a team that slid a little bit in the midseason, but heading into the conference championship game, Iowa was number 13 in the college football playoff selection committee rankings. So a respectable win for Ohio State in a bounce back scenario against the Hawkeyes would potentially give them that edge. That would be I've got it penciled in as Alabama 1, Georgia 2, Cincinnati 3, Ohio State 4. And another little note here. I would not want it to happen, but I would laugh. I would laugh pretty heartily to hear a selection committee member be like, and the conditions of that game, the snow in Ann Arbor really limited what Ohio State was able to do.
You know what I probably overlooked, though? If they would have beaten Iowa in the Big Ten championship game in a similar fashion, which I probably would have anticipated.
Agree.
That helps you forget a lot about that road loss the week before. It's just the nature of the recency bias, which comes into play.
Okay, so Notre Dame is the key piece of this next scenario where every result in college football is the same except for one, and it's in the SEC championship game. Instead of Alabama defeating Georgia, it is Georgia defeating Alabama and handing the Crimson Tide their second loss of the season. Heading into the conference championship game, Georgia was number 1 in the country. Alabama was number 3. Michigan was number 2. Cincinnati was number 4 heading into that conference championship game. If Alabama takes its second loss of the season, does it still make the college football playoff?
I'm going to say no. And I'm sure you guys probably noticed this. I started backing off that take as the more we saw of Alabama. If it would, because I think, it was pretty soon after getting beat. They bounced back with the Mississippi State game where they blew out Mississippi State. Then they beat Tennessee. They beat LSU. And it was probably right around Mexico State where maybe I said that. But then, not being super impressive over Arkansas. And the Auburn game, definitely after the Auburn game, felt like I backed off it man, I don't know if this is still viable. I still would have put it on the table. But I feel like, maybe if it came down to a field goal, it was one of those really tight games, they would have overlooked it. but I don't know. The way that they kind of came, like I was envisioning a Bama dominance, losing barely to Georgia, then they're in, and that scenario didn't exactly unfold. So I would say a 2-loss Bama, the way they finished the regular season, overtime against, man, even as I say that, Bryce Young, best quarterback in football, like you could hear him making the case. You could hear him making it. I could hear him now.
I think they made the case before it even started, because you mentioned, all right, so the one loss comes on October 9th, 41-38 at Texas A&M. Like you mentioned, 40-point win at Mississippi State. The next week it's 52-24 against Tennessee, and then they struggle with LSU. Those are the three results between the loss to Texas A&M and the release of the very first college football playoff rankings. So with only that body of work, the selection committee got together and put them at number 2. There were teams with zeros in the loss column all up and down the college football playoff rankings, and they were behind Alabama, which was sitting there at number 2. Even those late season struggles that you mentioned never fell lower than number 3. I think the favoritism that this selection committee showed towards Alabama from the start with that number 2 position, given the results that they had so far, suggests to me that Alabama would be a 2-loss non-conference champion, and Notre Dame fans would be absolutely furious. Strength of schedule becomes the big argument, and they end up getting left out, where Alabama ends up getting either the 3 or the 4 seed.
Yeah, I think Bama's probably in here, actually. Under the same argument that I made earlier with Notre Dame's schedule being pretty poor. You lose to an A&M team that was respected quite a bit by the committee. The committee also seemed to have an infatuation with Arkansas, which I don't really get. And it also kind of respected Auburn for quite a while. So there, I mean, you lose, you beat Florida on the road. Obviously, Florida didn't finish extremely well. But still, a lot of these close wins that Bama has are better than almost anything Notre Dame has. Notre Dame has Wisconsin, and that's kind of it. So the committee is big on, hey, like we're more about quality wins than we are about the loss column, which is not always true. It's just kind of something they say, but their actions don't seem to back it up a whole lot when you look at sort of the down ballot in the top 25. I think they try to power rate like the top 5 or 6, and then they basically just use the rest of the top 25, filling it out like in a tiered type way based on how many losses you have in conjunction with what makes their ratings look better at the very top. Obviously, you got to kind of show your work, even if you're working backwards. But I think I would probably go Bama here, even though they looked pretty shaky down the stretch. It is interesting. Both of these teams would have lost to a team that is already in the playoff, right? So UGA beat Bama, and then Cincinnati beat Notre Dame. So you might get into a situation where you're comparing the quality of loss.
Oh, right? No, not the quality loss.
Don't you think so? I mean, Chip, they would say, look, we already deemed Cincinnati in our little boardroom here. We've deemed Cincinnati a playoff quality team. Okay. We've deemed Georgia a playoff quality team, obviously. Cincinnati won by double digits in South Bend. Bama on a neutral site against Georgia, who we have number 1 with a bullet, is how much did they lose by? Like, I think that's probably the key crux of this question, as Danny noted.
I think that one of the biggest boosts to Alabama in this scenario is how much the committee loved Ole Miss and how dominant Alabama was in that game against the Rebels. Ole Miss was never lower than number 16, which was their starting point at the beginning of the college football playoff rankings. In the 6 releases from the committee, 16, 15, 12, 9, 8, 8. The Rebels finished the season well. The Rebels finished the season with an upward trajectory. That win would be something that I think that Notre Dame would not have anything to compare to, and really helped Alabama, because Texas A&M, these were the 6 results: 14, 11, 16, 15, 25, 25. As the Aggies took a couple on the chin coming down the stretch, that hurt their stock. But again, Ole Miss, with it surging, I think the Rebels would be able to really be able to anchor the Crimson Tide. And what would, again, like, would that be the college football playoff disaster? Not just a 2-loss team in the playoff, but a 2-loss non-conference champ, keeping Notre Dame out.
Yeah, because especially the SEC favoritism, the Alabama favoritism, like it would all have come to the forefront, and that would have been the most disastrous scenario, I think.